I am going to hand over straight away to Anne-Laure. I'm sorry, we're quite behind schedule, but we're really looking forward to hearing about your input as an operational player and your feedback on marine pollution. So straight over to you, Anne-Laure.
J'avais prévu de vous passer un film, je le mettrai à disposition, mais vu le timing, effectivement, c'était un film où ça nous permettait de rentrer dedans, c'était des images d'archives et un positionnement, effectivement.
After the event. But the film contains archive imagery with some examples of the work done by LPO. But first of all, I'm going to try and give you an overview based on past experience with what the points that appear important to us from our point of view. I'm going to be not only talking about post-pollution, but also during the spill. So first of all, LPO is an NGO that focuses on bird protection. We are representative of the French representative of BirdLife International. It groups together 121 NGOs. So in terms of environmental impact, earlier we saw a presentation about fish, also impacts on the environment. I just like to mention islands which are particularly exposed to pollution, particularly oil pollution. I'll be talking about the Cedre Nature Reserve that's very exposed to pollution. So here I've chosen to represent LPO. We work on biodiversity as a whole, but I am focusing on bird life. That's where the majority of our expertise is. So I like to apologize to the translators. I've put a lot of information on here. I'm not going to say it all. What's important is to determine the impact of the pollutant on the bird. So in the case of pelagic birds, the direct impact will be on their plumage. So if there's a hole in their plumage, even if it's one small droplet of oil, it's going to be problematic for the bird. The bird, if the bird's still at sea, he'll become weak. He might, it might be washed up on the shore alive, or it may wash up dead on the shore, or it may drown. When they haven't spent too much time at sea, we're more likely to recover them in a better condition. So that's in terms of physical impacts. Also, just an aside, birds as indicators. In the Moko Cadiz, in the Erica, what we saw was that birds can be indicators. And so as an NGO, we are interested in working on that aspect. We need to remember that nearly always birds arrive before the pollution does. So it helps it can be an indicator that can help with decision making in terms of response. The other indicator, without going into too much detail, and it is necessarily linked, is a geographical indicator. The bird will drift, especially if it's alive, it will drift with the current. And it could have been studied more, but for example, in the case of the Erica, birds began washing up first in southern Finistère and then in Morbihan. whereas modelling software indicated that the oil was likely to drift towards Charles-Maritime. So that's something that could have been further exploited. So we work together with Cedre. We take samples that are analysed by Cedre to identify the pollutant. So when I say we, that can be us as LPO, but also all those who are involved in the field. So we use this as an alert tool as well. When birds are washed up on the shoreline, it gives an idea, it's just a small indication of what's happening offshore. So Vigipol receives an alert when an oil bird washes up on the shoreline to alert the municipalities. So what's important to us as an NGO is to work together with all the stakeholders at an early stage in order to share information that can be important for what happens thereafter. Another direct impact is, of course, the bird's survival. The first point is that the bird can die at sea. It can drown, or it can wash up alive. In a normal year without any particular incidents, there's winter monitoring that is conducted. When a specific incident or event occurs, this monitoring will be adapted. There'll be specific monitoring. There are environmental protection associations that will be present. If birds wash up alive, they are systematically sent to certified rehabilitation facilities. We record the data on the species, the location where it washed up, the date, and so on. This is something new that didn't exist at the time of the Erika. In terms of certified facilities, French regulations are perhaps stricter or more extensive than in other countries. So a rehabilitation centre needs specific authorization. In France, we have permanent rehabilitation facilities and also mobile rehabilitation units. Here you can see some images of some of the species that we tend to find here. The two central photos with a puffin and a razorbill. Also on the right you have a guillemot. These are the three auk species that are most affected. They are on the shore at breeding time, so sadly they are emblematic species that are affected by spills. Here, when we talk about spills, there's something that we've understood now is that the further offshore a spill occurs, the greater the length of shoreline that's likely to be affected. We won't necessarily have a larger number of birds, but we'll have a larger variety of species affected. So in the case of the Prestige, it was very far offshore, affecting France, Spain and Portugal in terms of bird life. 21 species compared to 17 for the Erika. It might seem like a small difference, but for us it makes a big difference in terms of organization of rehabilitation. The different species are affected by stress in different ways. in our rehabilitation centres, we try to be specialised in different species. So to send specific species to a specific centre. This shows cleaning of an oiled bird. In certain countries, what they think is most important is first to clean the bird. In France, our protocols first involve stabilizing the bird's condition. Here we're looking at auks, but for example, with penguins, the protocol might be different. Auks spend a lot of time at sea, so it's very important that they have perfectly clean plumage. Here I've given you, showing you some photos of release just to have a bit of a positive note. In terms of ecological impact, as I mentioned earlier, the first impact is of course the impact on the individual. So of course the loss of individuals. There's also impact at species level, which will vary according to the season. Here you can see the bird, a common eider, which was quite emblematic of the Erica spill. It was a nesting species prior to the Erica spill, and following that we didn't have any nesting pairs at all straight after the spill. So it was mentioned a lot during the legal proceedings. The geographic location of the pollution is of course an important factor. To mention again the Cedre Nature Reserve of Perros-Guirec. There is a rehabilitation centre, and every winter we receive oiled birds. In October we had around 100 birds arriving from northern Brittany, and the oil sampled on them was identified to be that of the tanio. This is linked to the fact that we have nesting breeding birds in this nature reserve that are affected. The figures you see on the screen here, notably for gannets, we have 18,967. These are the number of birds nesting within the Cedre Nature Reserve. I know during the following presentations these aspects are going to be addressed, so I won't go into too much detail here, but I just wanted to say a few words about ecological damage and financial damage and damage to assets. What's difficult here is giving a value to an individual. In terms of damage to equipment or to assets and financial damage, it's fairly straightforward. How much does it cost to save a bird? When we're talking about ecological damage, we have to determine the market value of a protected species that's been destroyed. So there's no standardized method that's applied here. In terms of damage to equipment and financial impacts, in permanent rehabilitation facilities, as I was mentioning earlier, for example, ongoing winter arrivals of oiled birds, the simplest method, there are two methods. You can calculate the real cost for each bird. You can see here an example of that. The bracket that we've given here is 150 to 200 euros. But it's very difficult, and if you want to calculate the real cost, you need to determine the time, the times the bird has spent in the rehabilitation centre. For example, a bird might recover after 24 hours, and another bird might be released after 2 weeks. So we won't have spent the same amount of time on each bird. So it can be calculated, but it has to be based on the time spent in the rehabilitation centre. What we actually do, although it's an underestimate, is we take the total budget and divide it by the number of animals, number of birds. So the value that we obtain is between 80 and 100 euros per bird, although, as I say, it's an underestimate. So it's going to be variable according to how long they spend in the centre. In the event of an incident, it can be slightly different. In the case of the ERICA, there were facilities that were set up in an emergency, in the emergency situation. And so in that case, you could take the budget divided by the number of birds received. You could also use, you could also divide it by the number of birds released, for example. In the case of the legal proceedings following the ERICA spill, we used several methods, and it looks a bit scary, but we tried to give a market value to the individuals, and we used the price of game birds. So these are prices that are determined by OFB, the French Biodiversity Agency. So these figures date from the ERICA, and based on this we compared the different species that we received with game bird species. And if we had undetermined birds, for example, you saw the photo of a heavily oiled bird earlier, there's a pigeon price that was applied for undetermined species. The other principle that we put forward was to have a rarity threat coefficient. This was used for all the different species. I think this document will be available later, so I won't go into the detail of that here, but each category was given a value. So that gave us 6 categories. Normally there are only 5, but we created an extra one using the species of conservation concern categorization. There was a slight difference, but it was fairly close. Just a few words about the recognition of ecological damage. It's been a really drawn out fight for LPO. At the time of the Moko Kiddies, the LPO was already campaigning for the recognition of ecological damage. 10 years of legal proceedings for the ERICA until 2012. A lot of us were very involved in the legal proceedings. And in 2012, the Supreme Court recognized ecological damage, thanks in part to the work of LPO and the Morbihan area. And the amount obtained was a lump sum. In 2005, we systematically took cases of operational discharge of oil to court. In 2016, in an appeal case, the Court of Rennes recognized ecological damage. And in this case, they recognized the rarity and threat coefficient proposed by LPO. In 2019, again, after many years of legal proceedings, the Supreme Court recognized ecological damage with a lump sum compensation awarded. So there's no official method recognized by all the courts. The methods put forward often end up with lump sum compensation. Thankfully, regulations have evolved. Here I've given you the reference to the French regulations for the repair of ecological damage. It now features in French regulations. In bold here, I've highlighted the fact that the repair of ecological damage is by priority in kind. It should be repaired in kind. A little bit of further reading. I recommend this article by Héloïse Haddad Mimoun, who reminds us that there's no nomenclature currently. Thank you. I think I've come to the end of my presentation. Before you go, because I think you're in a hurry, there is a question. I think it's from Drea Alpaca. Please, could you specify the framework of your intervention on the coast, on the different France's different coasts? Is there agreement with the authorities, with the prefecture, or is it with the regional directorate of the environment? Depending on the incident, it was different. It's not always the same. For example, in the case of the Grande America, we worked with the DREAL, so the Regional Directorate for the Environment. When a spill occurs, first of all, the managers of rehabilitation facilities, well, they're always open 7 days a week, but when pollution is reported, they'll start to enter into dialogue with the authorities. And so they'll start getting organized, making space for birds that might be arriving. I think LPO in past incidents kind of took the bull by the horns and got in touch with the authorities. I think as Yvonne was saying earlier, sometimes there have been some gaps in terms of wildlife. When rehabilitation centres already exist, they will of course receive oiled animals, but we will require extra funding. So I think that's the time lapse, that's the delay that was being mentioned. But in any case, there is an existing agreement with the ministry, but it's the kind of standard agreement that could be used with other organizations. So we listed the different missions, establishing a rehabilitation center, caring for the birds, and so on. Thank you very much. We're just going to keep you a little bit longer because we have another question. I just want to mention that, yes, I worked together with Anne-Laure to develop the agreement she was mentioning. The idea being that from the outset, that state services would be able to work together with LPO. So we can make a standard agreement available if anyone wants to have a look at that. Thank you for that. Just a few additional words. You mentioned, I'd like to mention the Marseille court's decision in March 2020 about sea urchins. And this time it was an assessment of ecological impact per urchin. So, and they considered that the value of the urchin, of an individual urchin, and its value to the ecosystem. There were total, I think, an estimated total of 4,000 sea urchins that were poached, and 350,000 euros compensation were paid out for the repair of the affected environment. Now, unfortunately, the case was appealed, and the ecological damages awarded were divided by 7. But what's interesting is that this wasn't a lump sum compensation, but it was a sum per individual. So that might be interesting for future evolutions.